Hi, everybody. Your support means the world to us. Our podcast is really focused on creativity, on care, on stories of inspiration, and inspiring characters of all kinds. It's such a wonderful, wonderful way to reach community. This is a labor of love. So, the real way we can sustain ourselves is through all of your support. Please rate, ideally 5 stars. Please share this with anyone and everyone you know, and feel free to reach out to us also with suggestions on guests. Reach us at podcastutopias@gmail.com. Thank you, everybody, for your support. All right, everybody. I'm super, super excited to welcome Maurice Mitchell, who's just a really inspiring character. I consider Maurice a friend and a colleague. And Maurice Mitchell is the director of the Working Families Party here in the United States, is a nationally recognized social movement strategist. He was a leader in the movement for Black Lives. He has a community organizing background. And the Working Families Party is something maybe some of you have not heard about, but is an extremely important advocacy and movement-based group that actually endorses various candidates in national and regional, state, etc. elections. It was first organized and created in 1998 by a coalition of labor unions, advocates for protecting and empowering workers through political reform and social organizing. You'll see how inspiring Maurice is. He's just full of light, full of creativity, full of care, and full of just a real sense of what America can be, what life can be. And we discuss his own story as an organizer, where workers and labor is heading, and the critical theme, which is not thinking of themselves as either you're in my group and therefore you're out of my group, right? Sort of the power of a multiracial coalition that stands up for working people, regardless of sex or race or gender or disability or generation even. Maurice is super cool. We also talk a little bit about hardcore and punk. He comes out of a hardcore punk background, and his incredible, incredible cousin, the renowned rapper MF Doom. So everybody, please enjoy this conversation. It was originally recorded in January 2024, but you'll hear how incredibly relevant it is for the elections that are forthcoming. I'm so grateful to Maurice Mitchell, who's here joining us to join us today with the Utopias podcast. And Maurice is an incredibly inspiring person who I had the opportunity to see present at a meeting that we were at jointly back in October of 2023. And I left hearing Maurice's words and energy very inspired, and you joining us today is just perfectly fitting with what our podcast is about, which is really about caring for one another and repairing our disconnections and moving beyond these false constructs of division that those in power are employing to manipulate and sort of exploit us all. But moving beyond that, right? And so, Maurice, I just want to welcome you and ask you also first, tell us a little bit about like your youth, like some of your biggest inspirations artistically, politically, intellectually, personally, and kind of how you came up as an organizer, first and foremost.
Well, absolutely. And I before I start, I just have to say it's really good to be here. And there's no more important conversation, I think, to have. So I always jump at the opportunity to have, to me, it's the conversation about connection, right? Um, so just a little bit about myself. Before I could talk about myself, I really have to talk about my prehistory. Both of my parents are immigrants from the Caribbean. My dad is from the tiny island nation of Grenada. My mom is from the larger island nation of Trinidad and Tobago. And they came here, they followed my grandmother who came to the US as a domestic worker. And I was born in 79. And so I was born at the time, I was born at the point where most of my grandmother's children, she had, I think like 11 kids, had immigrated to the US and they were forming families. So I was surrounded by this big extended family and a lot of cousins. And a lot of play and a lot of fun and a lot of possibility. And it was almost like this cocoon against the backdrop of the 80s, which included mass incarceration and the crack epidemic, and my mother working as a registered nurse in Far Rockaway, and working at Detox. So working on the front lines of the crack epidemic and working to support people as they dealt with multiple chemical addictions, coming, coming from the streets, coming from different places, and me hearing those stories directly from the front lines of the crack war and the quote unquote war on drugs, and then me growing up as a little black boy in the suburbs of New York, in this multiracial suburb called Long Beach, which is on the South Shore of Long Island. And Long Beach is like an interesting place because most places in the United States are very racially segregated. And most suburbs in the United States are very racially segregated. So even on Long Island, you'll have a place like Roosevelt or Hempstead, which is largely Black and Latino, right next to Garden City, which is largely white. But in Long Beach, it was working class white ethnic people, Black folks, immigrants, and on my block were immigrants from all over the place, like my mom and my dad, and folks from the Dominican Republic, and folks from Central America and Latin America. And I didn't realize it, but that upbringing in such a racially and ethnically diverse place with the multiracial working class would kind of like be the perfect laboratory for the work that I do today, you know? Um, and so growing up in that environment and growing up and facing like the educational apartheid, because even though we are a multiracial school district, Black kids were tracked to special ed and tracked to the sort of lower tracks, and that happened to me in first grade. And we were hyper policed, and so growing up and learning how to drive and getting pulled over like over and over again was just like we just accepted like that was just what happened. And as a young person, with all of these influences, my father coming from Grenada, which was like a Black socialist republic, right? An independent Black socialist republic when I was born. And then it was invaded by the United States. So like
By Reagan, right? By
yeah, I'm dealing with this consciousness, this place that most of the people I'm related to, and a place that I would go back and forth to every single year since I was an infant. It's not being invaded by my country, right? And processing all that. Um, all of those things, and then witnessing the immigrant struggle of my parents and my grandmother, and the reality that race, class, gender, immigration status, I saw firsthand how it created real barriers for the ability of individuals to be able to experience joy and to be able to experience possibility in this country. All of those things, I think, developed my consciousness. And I very early on wanted to, and in ways that young people want to like be firefighters, I wanted to be a freedom fighter very early on. And I found opportunities, and I got involved in youth organizing very early. And that youth organizing journey on the grade school level led to me getting involved in local politics, or like I was volunteered for local Long Beach City Council, and like there was this insurgent city council person. I, as a teenager, was involved in that race, and eventually it informed where I went to college. I decided to go to Howard University because I wanted to be on the front lines of this story of sort of Black resistance and Black institutions like HBCUs and SNCC, the civil rights organization. Many of the leaders of SNCC came through Howard, like Stokely Carmichael. In the 80s was an exciting time culturally in New York. It was the New York is the birthplace of hip hop. And I got a front row seat to that because my cousins started a hip hop group, and I'm watching Yo MTV Raps, and I'm like, that's my cousin, right?
You mean KMD? Is it
Yeah,
like, yeah, I love KMD. The great MF Doom and his brother, right? Your cousin, right?
that's right.
Yeah.
Sub Rock, rest in peace. So
Oh,
you
rest.
couldn't tell me you couldn't tell me anything growing up because Zev Love X and Sub Rock were my cousins, right? And they're huge influences on me because I saw them like, and also they rep both of them at the time when you were doing hip hop in New York, it was all of the aspects, all of the different elements of hip hop. So, like, they were breakdancing, they were graffiti artists, they were producing and DJs, they were MCs, both Sub Rock and Zev Love X, who would eventually become MF Doom. They mastered all of the elements, and so I witnessed them make nothing out of something. Like the second KMD record was made, like almost 80% of it was made in the house that I grew up in with my mom and my dad in the basement. So I witnessed the second KMD record, Black Bastards, get made. I saw them use the SP 1200 sampler,
I
and I
know it.
saw
Yeah, yeah.
Doom, you know, cut the samples and sequence them, and in my basement as a young person, and so I was deeply, deeply, deeply inspired by that. And I eventually, when I came of age, I became the lead singer of a hardcore punk rock group. And there's no way I would have done that if I wasn't inspired by witnessing what Doom did, and what Sub Rock did, and this idea you can make something out of nothing, that you could do it yourself. Like, that's the DIY ethic of punk rock. Like, you don't have to wait for a record label. You don't have to wait for an intermediary. You could do it yourself. And that punk rock ethos is something that lives in me. The hip hop culture is something that lives in me. That immigrant struggle is something that lives in me and defines how I think about what's possible. Also, growing up in this very multiracial working class suburb, I understand difference in a very deep way. Touring with my band. And so I was touring with my band as a teenager in my 20s and crisscrossing the country and leaving New York and leaving the coast and playing in the Bible Belt, playing in some of the whitest, most homogeneous parts of the country, and me having to face whatever concerns I might have about what that might look like, and then dealing with it in real time, and like having fans that ran the gamut of identity and helping to shape their political consciousness. I was like, oh, this is possible. We could build a bigger we across difference. It could really happen. And culture is really one of the most powerful tools to do that. I saw that in real time. I experienced that. So all those things, I think, conspired to make me who I am. And, you know, having an experience like coming up at Howard University, and one of our classmates was killed, and how that politicized so many people, and how I was on the forefront of that. So I got to organize mass mobilizations around the death of Prince Jones, our classmate who was, rest in peace, who was killed by an undercover police officer. All of these things, it's like when you look back, you realize how all of these seemingly dissimilar random events, how they kind of piece together your identity, piece together your story, but they all kind of fit together in this interesting way. And I feel like have adapted me to this place of being, really primed to lean into this question that you talked about of connection across difference, meeting difference with curiosity, being able to build a container that's big enough for all of us.
It's beautifully said. Meeting difference with curiosity. And one thing I noticed about just sort of about you when I met you, it was briefly, was I noticed something within you where I was like, Maurice can get along with pretty much everybody. I could see that Maurice can bridge with pretty much anybody and everybody. And I think that's sort of where I wanted to kind of go with next is, from growing up in Long Beach and Long Island to which is a multiracial working middle class community, probably more middle class now than before.
Yeah, absolutely.
From bridging, art, different kinds of art cultures, from like punk rock culture, which is sort of can appeals to a lot of different people from a lot of different, well, some segments of society, to hip hop culture, to going to a historic Black college. what I sense in all of it is all of these are not modes of separating yourself from others, but modes of building bridges with others. And I guess that's where I want to ask you to just kind of elaborate on, you know, many people out of a space of anxiety and insecurity and fear being manipulated by mainstream media, by corporate media or particular elites, including neo-fascist elites, are concerned when they hear, oh, this is someone who went to a historically black college. Oh, this is someone who was into hip hop. Oh, this is someone who was into punk rock. Or this is someone whose family is Afro-Caribbean, you know, whether it's Grenada, Trinidad, both countries I dream of visiting personally. Um, but actually, I really sense and feel very clearly, knowing also you and knowing about what you've stood for and stand for, that these are all modes of building bridges with all peoples, right? And I want to speak to you. I want to ask you about that, how you express that, where that comes for you, and then ask you about the Working Families Party, which is an important progressive institution, but we call we're calling it progressive, but it's actually for everybody. It's for
Absolutely.
everybody. I've been a supporter of the Working Families Party dating back several years, 8, 9 years. And when I worked on the Sanders campaign, we were definitely wanting full throttle support, which we got some from y'all. So like tell us a little bit, about this. So these are not modes of isolation or dividing, they're modes of deeper connection.
Yes, yes. There's a lot of places I could go.
Wherever you wish. Yeah.
So one place I want to focus on is this place around identity. Okay. Because identity, we all have identities. Identity is like how you view yourself, right? And identity could be used in many different ways. So there's a lot of examples of some of the ways that identity could be used in order to advance authoritarianism, in order to separate people, like, white Christian nationalism and all this other stuff, and other nationalist movements, like here and around the world. We see how, if it's white Christian nationalism in the United States or in Europe, or if it's like Hindu nationalism in India, or if it's other forms of identity-based national, like look what's happening in Israel and Palestine right now, right? So um, we certainly see how identity could be used as a tool of division, of hate, of war, of violence. And we could draw from that there's something fundamentally problematic with identity and identitarian politics. I don't necessarily draw that conclusion. And I'll use an example. You brought up Howard. So I remember I was really excited to go to Howard University, historically Black college. And I got some pushback from some folks who are like, oh, well, you're going to Howard. Are you concerned that Howard will not prepare you to engage more broadly with people across race and across identity? Because it's a historically Black college. You're going to spend 4 years, not a completely monocultural, because Howard is still ethnically and racially diverse. There's like white folks who go to Howard, and there's Black folks who go to Howard from all over the world. But still, like, you're going to a place that is largely focused on the Black tradition, but you live in America. So wouldn't you want to go to a predominantly white school or another school so that you could adapt to navigating America, right? And I really pushed back on that. And my experience at Howard allowed me, well, number one, it afforded me a space where, I mean, there would be times where, because I grew up in Long Island, I grew up in Long Beach, so it was very multiracial. Our school was very multiracial, but predominantly white. Eventually, I I clawed my way out of the special ed and lower track, and I found myself in honors and AP classes where I often was the only Black kid, maybe one or two Black kids. So my experience was going to AP English or AP Social Studies or whatever with a lot of white kids. And I can't tell you how intensely uncomfortable it was during the O.J. Simpson trial, during the verdict, to sit in my AP English class and be the only Black student, right? So I definitely craved going to Howard. And what I experienced was like, it's almost like something you wouldn't necessarily assume, but race was not as much of a factor at Howard because most, if not everybody, was Black, right? And so it allowed me 4 years as I'm coming into my adulthood to develop my self-confidence in ways outside of the intense racial divide that is so pronounced when you're in the multiracial spaces, right? So it affirmed my identity. It allowed me to be more me. It allowed me to feel more confident in my skin. It is not mutually exclusive for me to affirm my identity as a Black person and to affirm my identity as a human. In fact, there's ways that affirming and understanding myself in the context of a Black historical tradition and the Black culture and feeling that and deepening that allows me to have more compassion and a deeper access to the human story because people may not share my Black identity, but the development of the richness of my understanding of my identity allows me to be more curious and more interested about somebody else's story. And that is how identity and things like ethnic pride and things like pride in your tradition can allow you to be curious and compassionate about others who don't share your tradition or share your ethnic foods or share your particular stories, but have their own stories. And you could understand their sense of pride because you feel that sense of pride too. You could understand their excitement because, and then you could notice the similarities and differences. It's like, oh, yeah, well, in Trinidad, we have something similar, but we do it this way. You do it that way. And you begin to delight in this broader human story. It's kind of like each of our stories are tributaries that lead to a bigger river, right?
Beautifully put. Beautifully put. Yeah. Yeah.
And so identity, in the same way, when you read an amazing story or amazing novel, one of the things that makes that novel amazing is how clear its point of view is. If you read a novel that was like blasé about its point of view, that didn't develop its characters deeply, that was kind of like circumspect about the storyline, it would be boring, it would be trite, it wouldn't be interesting, it wouldn't be remarkable. Our uniqueness, the clarity of our uniqueness, the sharpness of our difference makes us interesting and makes the conversation that I might have with someone else worth having. And so that's how we can marshal identity in order to build solidarity. It's how, it's in the how. We could use identity to sharpen our differences. We could use identity and tell a story that says our identities are totalizing. We could say that our identities prohibit us from ever aligning. We could do that. Or we could say that our identities allow us to sit from our place in our humanity so that we could see other people sitting in their humanity. That's a choice. And this idea that we should look away from our differences, I don't agree with that. I don't think that that's how we come together, by ignoring our differences, that only focusing on the things that make us similar. That's sort of like kumbaya, like let's just focus on our similarities. There's nothing interesting to me about that, right? I believe we have similarities, and I think we should acknowledge them, and we have differences, and we can't look past them. And there's nothing in itself about difference that suggests conflict and violence. Difference
Mm,
can be a
yeah.
venue for curiosity or a venue for conflict. It's up to us to decide what we want to do.
Yeah, difference is actually the basis by which we can recognize our own our own identities in a way where we can share with others, where we can have curiosity about others. You know, that the metaphor you used of tributaries flowing into a river is really powerful. I mean, you know, for example, I'm South Indian, and I've always been so interested in going to Trinidad, also to Tobago, also to Guyana in South America, partly because these are Indo-diasporic as well as Afro-diasporic, meaning they're, you know, in Trinidad, as you know, many people are of Indian descent or combined like Afro and Indian descent. I'm also super down with the food of not that this is only about food, though I'm hungry right now, but like but it's like I've had the opportunity to have food from Trinidad when I've been in New York and Brooklyn, and places like that. And it's like it's very shared cuisine with our Indian food, you know. It's like
Absolutely.
rocking food, you know. So these are these beautiful synergies. Yeah.
I'll give you a story about my family's history. And so yeah, I have cousins who are mixed Indo and African Trinidadian, like, and we have like words for that. Like if you're half Indian, half from Afro descendant, you're a Dogala, and you could be a Trigala, and you could be, we have a whole set of ways of describing how folks come together. And the thing is, like, Trinidad is one of the countries that I think really models what a melting pot could be, because not only do you have like a significant folks who have a history around the transatlantic slave trade and could trace our roots back to West Africa and other places, and you have folks who, following slavery, came in as indentured servants from the Indian subcontinent. You also have a significant number of folks who came in since the 1800s from China and from Syria and so it's like a real melting pot. But what I was going to say is that my family is from South Trinidad, and there were at the time that my grandmother was growing up, there were a lot of folks coming in from the subcontinent. And so my grandmother, on top of speaking English fluently, she spoke Hindi fluently because she had to communicate with the folks in
Wow.
her community. And so there was a real sort of commingling of these cultures. And like the food that I grew up eating, I grew up eating curry chana and aloo pies,
Ooh.
and like this is the food that I grew up eating. And so there's something really beautiful about, that's the one thing about culture, about language. It's constantly evolving, right? And we have forces that will always exist in our society. These are conservative forces, right?
Yeah.
Who seek to either slow change or to almost lock society in amber, just lock it in place, right? And what we know is that that's a fool's errand. The best they could do is slow things down. But, for example, people get really upset about things like, stuff around language, right? Like words have definitions. It's true, but we know because we don't speak in Old English.
No, we don't. We don't speak like the Canterbury Tales or
Yeah,
anything.
language and words naturally evolve. They just do, and they have different meanings over time, and that's just how things work. And this idea that there's this like puritanical, often white supremacist idea that there's something that you could call a pure racial category, right? It's just like peoples bump into each other and commingle, and for different reasons, both like problematic and just like maybe neutral and maybe positive, like intermarry and cultures shift. And this is the human story. You could like it, you could not like it, but it is the story of humanity. And I feel like when you talk about progressives, whatever that means, I think one way of understanding it is like people who have a tolerance for the natural change and shifts and butting up against each other that humans do. And one way of understanding conservatives are people who lack that tolerance and perennially are frustrated with the ways that things kind of shift and change. And it can create a lot of anxiety. It can create a lot of discomfort, but it is naturally how humans progress and evolve throughout time.
It's really powerful because it's sort of like for our white brothers and sisters, love, your own ethnicity and your own culture and your own ancestors and your own traditions. And if you actually really love that, you'll recognize how much you can actually love other identities, other peoples, other who are themselves blends of many different things. So it's actually really sounds much more like a question of whether we can truly love where we come from and who we are, so that we can actually learn from others and share with others and so on. So it's sort of like this battle between the frozenness, the containment, the carceral, which is a term I heard you use when you spoke at PopTech, the incarceration of ourselves, right? So many people who have been manipulated to be in the so-called conservative movement these days are actually manipulated to be down on themselves and who they are and what they stand for, and actually have been put in a prison, manipulated by fear. And
Oh,
really and it's really really I think important what you're saying and sharing here. I had the blessing of having on this podcast uh interviewing the great Cornel West,
mm-hmm.
who's an independent candidate right now for the presidency, as you know better than anybody.
Mm-hmm.
And what Dr. West told me, we mainly talked about political philosophy and the question that he asked decades ago, which is, what does it mean to be human? He asked that question when he wrote Race Matters, I don't know, 30 years ago or so. Um, and in that, he made the point that, instead of seeing like Black people's or even the movement for Black lives as sort of a way of saying of voicing, anger and discontent and the desire to blow it all up and a threat and violent and all. What Dr. West said is actually it's an opportunity to listen to where people are at and their fears, and actually through that reach a greater place of love. So he always, he kept saying, Coltrane's a love supreme, Albert Eiler, I know that's more like out there. You probably it like crazy free jazz stuff, like spiritual unity, Sun Ra, the visions of sort of a new future. These are not about disconnection. This is about recognizing through beauty and pain and suffering and compassion a greater sense of oneness, and what the great Buddhist monk who's a huge influence on me, Thich Nhat Hanh, called interbeing. He says there's no lotus without the mud. There's no mud without the lotus. That's true also for all of us who are living beings. um
Um,
yeah.
that really brings, so you mentioned interconnection, and I just want to stop there for a second because, you know, we talk about the spiritual, right? Um, some people could identify with the spiritual, some people can't. But fundamentally, when I think about the spiritual and when I fundamentally think about what that means, to me, the definition of the spiritual is connection. That's ultimately what we're talking about. When people talk about having spiritual experiences, they're ultimately talking about when they are the most connected, when they feel the most connected, when they feel the most rooted, when they feel the most connected to the universe, when they feel the most connected to other people. People are generally talking about that transcendent feeling when it's not just, you don't just feel and process things through your ego. It's this heightened thing where you're like, oh, I actually feel like I'm a part of the universe. I'm a part of something much bigger, like this big, massive body that is this spiritual community or this political community or this. And to me, one of the things I try to urge people to do is like do the connection test in order to gauge whether or not a movement or a political actor or whoever is something that might be of deep value to you. Does this movement, does this ideology, does this political actor bring you in deeper connection with others, with the universe, or is it closing things off? Is it shutting things off? And one way of thinking about like the work that I do is I'm seeking to get more people to be more connected to themselves, to the planet. And my belief is that from that place of connection, you will naturally make decisions that are rooted in the common good. And when you're disconnected, it's much easier and it makes so much sense to feel closed off, to feel a true sense of physical and economic insecurity, and then operate from that place. What I've noticed, this is in my interpersonal relationships, my family relationships, my romantic relationships, the work that I've done, when somebody is operating from a place of insecurity compared to when somebody is operating from a place of security, their decision making, the choices that they make, what they feel is most available to them is markedly different.
Abundance. Abundance,
I
right?
could speak from my own experience. I've had, and I think a lot of people in your listening audience, and maybe yourself, I've had bouts with anxiety. And one of the things that I noticed
Every day. Every
when I
day.
was feeling deep anxiety, it's fascinating. It was almost like my brain had conspired against me to not imagine that certain things that were very available to imagine that they weren't available at all. So when I was in anxiety brain, I felt like I was totally alone, like nobody cared about me, that I couldn't pick up the phone and talk to somebody who would have answered and given me inspiration. Like I didn't believe those things were available. And so when I was outside of anxiety brain, I could pick up the phone and talk to my brother and be like, "Hey, bro, you're there." And so it's what these political movements that sort of prey on people's sense of isolation and insecurity, what they're tapping into is that anxiety brain, the feeling that those things aren't available, that abundance isn't available to you. And so you have to batten up the hatchets. You have to build the wall. You have to weaponize your politics. And if you notice, those political movements, they tend to redistribute cruelty. And political movements and other movements that are rooted in connection tend to redistribute compassion. And so when I'm asking people to use their critical thinking to decide where they want to build their sort of their political home, which movements they might want to lean into, which political actors they might want to trust or not trust, who's using the venue of politics to redistribute cruelty, and who's using the venue of politics to redistribute compassion. And here, the reality is we're human, we're flawed. We all have our cruelties, we all have our prejudices. I hope that most of us would like to work on our prejudices and our cruelties and keep them private. And but with our compassion, we'd like to make that public, right? And so the political actors and movements that are seeking to do that. For example, I think it's great that there are governors who are passing legislation to ensure that every single child has access to free lunch in school, right? And it's funny because once that started to become a trend, there were some legislatures that were proactively preventing that from happening. So it's like, to me, it is a choice of redistributing compassion or redistributing cruelty. People who would take the pen of legislation and choose to make it harder for a very, very small, deeply at risk population, trans young people, right? You could take that pen and you could legislate anything. And the thing that you choose to legislate, the thing that you choose to use this immense legislative power on is making life harder for a very, very small, very at-risk population of trans students that may or may not want to join youth sports, or trans students that are still trying to figure out their identity. It's like an immense power used for something as immensely petty and cruel, right? And to me, this tells us what is operating spiritually behind some of these political movements, and hopefully it can inform who we choose to spend our time with.
It's just a scapegoating and it's a distraction by taking an extremely small percentage of the overall population that are also human beings. No one can deny that, and sort of turning them into sort of this place of people's anxiety and their fear and their sense of isolation to focus their attention on, and turning it into like a Leviathan, turning it into
Oh,
a boogeyman. It's a totally fabricated and manufactured mode of dividing us all. And the thing about it is, like, when you're sort of like when you're succumbing, or you're the manipulator of this sort of, as you called it, the anxiety brain, the thing that I think people who are stuck in that or have been pushed into that feel is they're very unhappy. They're suffering, right? They're actually suffering. So it's sort of like it's like these choices or these forms of manipulation are creating greater unhappiness and suffering for yourself. So, like, instead of seeing these things as political, like, left, right, progressive, blah 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 nonsense, Democrat, Republican, what does that even mean, right? It's more. I mean, it means something at this point. I'm not diminishing it, but there's something far deeper, which is the question of whether you want to live a life where it's not even about trusting others, where you're just kind of like that's abundant, where you let things, where you kind of go with the flow, right? Like for your tributary river example, where you don't close yourself off and become more isolated, more alienated, more depressed, and realize that actually you're living in this fabricated world where you're a pawn in someone else's game, which whether it's a neo-Nazi fascist machine game or whether it's like a neoliberal nonsensical game as well.
Yeah, I wanted to speak to that, right? Because when you take several steps back, and I'm glad you talked about this suffering, which is actually an opportunity for connection and for compassion, right? Because in some ways, suffering is the human condition, so we could all identify with it.
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
also, there's a way that there's a particular quality of the suffering that so many of us are experiencing that could actually be cause for us to talk across difference. And one of the things that's taking place that's causing a lot of anxiety and that's producing a lot of suffering is the fact that the fundamental systems that we were told were rock solid and resilient and designed to make things better. And we were told a story about, for Americans, we were told the story about American exceptionalism and how great this country was and how it was the greatest country on earth and the greatest country in the history of countries
Ever. Yeah.
and the wealthiest, most powerful country. And so there's a deep contradiction in that story of this country being the greatest country ever, the wealthiest and most powerful country ever, the wealthiest country in the history of countries, of our system of democracy being the most pristine democracy that, and it's so great that it should be exported elsewhere. And also, as an individual who's experienced life over the past 40 years, witnessing in your community the gutting of the industrial core and thousands and thousands and thousands of families being disrupted because people can't work with dignity and support their families anymore. And people medicating through all different types of ways, and people
All
experience,
types of things. Yeah.
yeah, and people experiencing a deep loss, a loss of their dignity, right? This is happening community after community after community, millions of people, because of like concrete decisions like free trade agreements, right? Which over decades have totally ripped out the core of communities. There was a time where millions of families were able to sustain themselves through the income of one person, right? Who had a job that was something that they could be proud of. They were building things, and they had, rigorous unions that organized them. Like unions were at double digits, private sector unions. Now they're at single digits, right? And those unions afforded folks all types of um, all types of benefits, including pensions that allowed people to live out their lives in dignity and afforded people the opportunity to be able to send their kids to college and other things like that, and to be able to get a piece of the American dream and all those things. Witnessing year after year, decade after decade, that the myth of the American dream sort of dematerialize in front of you, um, you feel the sense that your dignity was stolen from you, that you were lied to, that these systems that were supposed to be rock solid were a fallacy. We lived through a pandemic, which was a test of all of these presumably rock solid systems, and they collapsed. The American health system collapsed. The the global economy collapsed, right? It completely collapsed. And we learned how fragile these systems really are. And we'll never go back from that. And so people are feeling a deep sense that they were lied to, that they were somehow stolen from. And people deeply want to restore their dignity. People want somebody to witness their suffering. And that is such a human thing. And the neoliberal sort of elite refuse to witness the suffering that is happening all across working people, all across the world. the right wing is happy to witness people suffering, which is such a deeply connecting thing, ironically, right? People just want to witness to their suffering. And what a lot of the neoliberal politicians and other folks who are relatively comfortable continue to say is like, don't believe your eyes and ears, things are getting better. What many of the right-wing populists are saying is like, you should believe your eyes and ears. That feeling of deep dread, of physical and economic insecurity, of anxiety, that's real. That feeling that somebody somehow stole something from you, that's real. They did. The elites did. And then they flip the story and they say the elites stole it from you, and then they gave it to the other. They gave it to the immigrants. They gave it to the welfare queen. And join me. Join me. I will help you restore your dignity so you can protect your family. And I will met out pain against the elite and those others.
I
And
will be your retribution was literally said by the former president, who, terrifyingly enough, is pretty much secured the Republican nomination as we speak. I will be
yes,
your retribution.
and we have to understand why that's a compelling message. For some people are really scared that he would say that, but there's a reason why some people are compelled by that because something did happen, right? Decisions were made. People's dignities have been robbed from them. And so we need to be compassionate if we wish to build a bigger we, and simply be witness to people suffering. The neoliberal elite refuse to be witness to people suffering, because if they're witness to people suffering, they'll have to do something to ameliorate that suffering. And that the things that they will have to do to ameliorate that suffering will deeply upset the status quo in ways that they're not willing to do,
Oh,
which
it
is
was their choice. It was their choices and their decisions that led to a situation, and many of them, including the corporate wing of the Democratic Party
absolutely.
and the sort of like, kind of the now sort of neocons who are like now a smaller percentage of the Republican Party, refuse to acknowledge reality. They refuse to acknowledge what people of all walks of life in the US, including so many white folks, black folks, brown folks, all types, are experiencing, which is that fundamentally life expectancy is declining in this country. The youngest generation in this country is the first to make less than its parents in the history of the US, even if you control for inflation, which is extremely high. We have elites in the Democratic Party, including in the executive wing, who refuse to acknowledge this and say, oh yeah, employment's, doing great, but there's greater wage precarity than ever before. There's a declining expectancy. There's the gigification of work. It's all turning into drive this thing for Uber, that thing for Postmates, this and that. No healthcare, no pensions, no unionization. So it's like one group, which has not all the energy, but a lot of energy, is saying, well, I'll be a retribution. We're just going to, go after all these invaders, all these terrorists, so to speak. And at least there's an acknowledgement of the conditions of being dispossessed, of being alienated, of being disconnected from yourself. And why and how do we change this situation to actually transform this country in a place of greater interconnection, that we're all in it together, greater care, greater repair? Like, how do we even do that? You're an organizer, you're the head of the Working Families Party. Can you help us think through this, Maurice?
Yeah, I mean, we have to. So something I think about a lot. And the story that I want to tell, because we're raised in a manner where, from early on, we observe this caste system. We live in a system of economic caste in this country and around the world. So there's just a few thousand billionaires on the planet, and they basically live like living gods. It's very rare for any of them to experience any accountability. They just kind of do whatever they want to do, and
Many want to go to space.
yes,
They're
yeah. I mean, they're
ready to bounce, like as Tribe Called Quest in the first track on their final album, Rest in Power to Fife,
outside.
says the space program, we stuck here. or like Whitey on the Moon from Gil Scott Heron, right? It's like all these things. They want to bounce, but it's not about white folks. It's these elites, which could
Yes.
be are not merely white, right? It's not about that, but they are disconnecting. They're creating these modes of disconnection, and they themselves are disconnected, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a multinational elite class of people, right? Led by the elites of the global north, but not exclusively, right? And yeah, I mean it's the logic, right? The logic behind the idea that you have the capacity, right? Like I hear them talking about terraforming Mars or terraforming the moon, which basically means
Oh
like
yeah.
making an environment that is hospitable for um, human life on a place like Mars. If you have the capacity to develop that type of technology, why would you not use it to terraform Earth? Right? Why would you not use it to reverse the horrible impacts of climate change? And it's like, well, the logic, it makes sense because the logic of both colonization and neoliberal capitalism conspire, where the only conclusion is to colonize another territory once you've kind of run through the territory that you've run through, rather than figure out how to create a regenerative sort of strategy, right? So it makes sense based on that logic, but that logic doesn't make any sense, right? The fundamental logic, and here's the thing,
It
the
implodes upon itself. Yeah.
yes, and I think people are recognizing that. Like, wait, we live on a finite planet, but the logic of neoliberal capitalism is unlimited growth. How can that happen when we have finite resources? At some point, those two things are going to clash, and we're experiencing it, right? That is the climate calamity. Like we have one Earth, we don't have multiple Earths, but we have this scheme in neoliberal capitalism where it's not simply about creating profitable companies or driving a profit. The profit that you make this year, the profit that you make next year has to exceed the profit that you make this year in perpetuity. That's the only way that you have a successful business. So it's not enough that your business is profitable. It has to grow. Everything has to grow. And we don't stop to think about like why? How is that logical? How does that make sense? It's just baked into the way that we think about things. That is how deeply neoliberal capitalism and its logic has like informed everything that we do. But back to the question of this caste system. So yeah, we don't really think about the fact that we live in this intense caste system. There's billions of people on the planet, just a few thousand billionaires that live like gods, and there's many more, but still a relatively small number of like multimillionaires. Then there's like everybody else who's trying to eke it by, and then there's a underclass of people living in the billions, living in abject poverty, right? And rarely do we take a step back and recognize that we're living in this intense caste system. Um, and rarely do we take a step back to question what our role is in replicating it or challenging it, right? But there's so much more of us than the few thousand billionaires. And the story that we tell is about this elite class that has somehow, through their merit, gained access to the upper echelons of business, of politics, of media, and they have their hands on the wheel. But we should begin to ask our questions. Okay, this group of a few thousand people have their hands on the wheel. Where have they driven the car? Where have we gone as humanity? We've gone into crisis after crisis after crisis. So perhaps the elite, right? There's a myth of this sort of elite meritocracy. Perhaps they aren't as merited to have their hands on the wheel. And what would it look like if all of us, there's billions of us, if we decided that it was time for us to put our hands on the wheel? All of us everyday people, instead of looking up to, like, I don't know, pick a billionaire, Mark Zuckerberg or Elon Musk. What
Yeah.
if we looked towards one another? And so that's the story that I'm interested in telling. And yes, we have differences. We have a lot of differences. But what if we looked towards one another? We could talk about our differences, we could argue about our differences, but we could work on things like, for example, whatever our differences, I would argue that most people who are listening could agree that in the richest country in the history of countries, it's like morally appalling that any child goes to bed hungry. Let's work on that together as we argue about our differences.
And the vast majority of us agree on those specific policies, right? I mean, the vast majority of people support a ceasefire in Gaza as well, by the way. So it's sort of like all these. And when we say neoliberal, just for all the listeners, we're talking about the ways in which the economy, everything was deregulated, and private corporations were given all the power to do whatever they want, including essentially corrupt the state, include corrupt the government. And that's a huge part of the problem, which is that our politicians are actually bending the knee almost always to private corporations who, in their, as you said, in their only interest is to keep making more and more and more profit, keep extracting more surplus value per, like, Marx's clarification of that concept. So it's sort of like more, but there is at some point more ends. I mean, even if you want to bounce to Mars, and so that the thing that's sort of that's I think very, very telling here is, right now in the United States, three people have equivalent wealth to, I don't know, around 170 million Americans. Three people to 170 million. And on the planet, eight people with equivalent wealth to almost 4 billion, right? And I don't know about your life, Maurice, but I'll tell you in my life, I'm very rarely interacting with or hanging out with those three people. I'm very rarely hanging out or interacting with those eight people. I haven't met any of them. I did meet Zuckerberg once. I'll tell you that story sometime. But why don't we just, instead of looking, it's like, don't look up. It's like, but it's also like look around. We're all in the same boats here, right? We're all in the same boat. So it's sort of like, how, so this is the big question, I think, given the that the that the state and policymakers and by and large, many of our congressional reps, our senators, in my humble opinion, have been corrupted
That's
by this system. That's what it is. And I'm not saying this to call out Republicans or
no,
Democrats. I'm calling out everybody
that's
who,
right.
who's doing that, from lobbyist power to corporate donors to, the revolving door between military industrial complex contractors and our Defense Department. Like, it's just again and again and again. And it doesn't matter who you're talking about, including the former president and the current president, right? And it's like both. It's so there's this false sort of thing, like, this is evil, this is good, but actually they're both out out of touch with us all. So
Yeah,
then, how do we overcome that corruption that has taken root in this country, that came with there were a lot of problems before, don't get me wrong, but there also is a lot of beauty then and now. And all of this came into root in the early 80s, when the former President Reagan and Thatcher in the UK and others in the European Union, in the so-called global north, just said again and again and again, we're just going to, like, let corporate immunity.
yeah,
How do
yeah.
we overcome that at this point?
It's a great question, and one that I've recently thought deeply about. But here's the thing that I think is happening, which I think suggests possibility. I'll just say possibility, and possibilities could go in all different types of directions. So it's not inevitability, right? So we're 40 years out on this experiment, right? And like there was capitalism before, but this particular stage of capitalism that, like you said, its hallmarks are very as a very specific philosophy that is it's kind of, like, and there's a lot of, like, it's almost like a religion, right? Because there's like a lot of pieces to that philosophy, including like shareholder supremacy, the idea that if you're a corporation, the only thing you should concern yourself is remunerating your shareholders, and you shouldn't concern yourself with like the corporate impact to your workers or to your community and all these other things. So we're 40 years out on this experiment. And it turns out that, and there was a point where they were so confident, they said that there is no alternative. This is it, right? But it turns out that this stuff actually doesn't work. And we know it doesn't work, right? Because it's been stress tested, and we went from subprime mortgage crisis, right? And whenever these crises happen, they suspend the rules of neoliberalism in order to save the system, right? Right. And so subprime mortgage crisis. So it turns out that in a crisis, when you have to save the system, automatically the central bank could just make trillions of dollars and just like the money that
Print
they
money.
claim is not available to alleviate poverty, the money that they claim is not available in order to create a vibrant commons is automatically available in order to protect the interests of corporations. So it's like, all right, we'll bail out all of these banks. We'll bail out all of these folks who actually drove us into this crisis during COVID, because we had to figure out how to progress as a society when a lot of us weren't working, these checks materialized. It turns out our government could have always done that, right? And we've experienced it, and it turns out that yeah, the government could print money, send it to everybody, and the economy is not just fine, it actually like stimulates the economy, right? And so we've witnessed, number one, how the rules of neoliberalism lead to crisis. And number two, how you have to suspend the rules in order to prevent a complete collapse. And we've seen it with our own eyes. So it's not like this academic thing. Most people have seen it to the point where the very corporate interests are beginning to recognize, like, oh, yeah, this is probably the end. We're witnessing the end of neoliberalism. We're witnessing, like, there are limitations to this system, and there are fundamental contradictions in the system that require us to imagine a new system. So that's happening right now. And, there's like all types of philosophies that talk about what it might mean when you're in a period of time where the old systems are dying and the possibility of a new system is emerging. There's a point potentially in that time where many, many people, like popularly, not just deep political observers, but my cousin, your cousin, everyday workers, are beginning to question the legitimacy of the overall system and beginning to question the legitimacy of our corporate rulers and the elite. I think we're in a moment like that. And so that means it's in that moment when the old system hasn't been built. If we do our organizing with people who are beginning to say, hey, this stuff isn't working, we might be able to lead what that new thing is, perhaps, right? And that to me is the hope of this moment. The old system is dying, right? Gramsci talks about this, right? The old system is dying. The new systems might emerge, and we could be the authors of that new system. And it's at a place where we see the symptoms of the old system dying. I could have a conversation about this, not just with like academics and political theorists and whatever, with everyday people about, yeah, I went through the pandemic. I witnessed the deep loss of losing family members. We lost more than 1 million people in this country. I witnessed our government fail us completely. All of the people who's supposed to have the degrees and know all the things and all the economists, they failed us. And now we're emerging out of that. What is it we're emerging into? I want to be a part of figuring that out. If we look towards one another, we could potentially be the tip of the spear of the new world. And that to me is really exciting. It's an invitation. It's something that people, I believe, are primed to engage with on a very, very popular level.
And I think what's powerful there is it's looking to one another, but also if we just look at ourselves and our own lives, we realize that the system as is not working. So you can either sort of go with some sort of like more and more hate, which actually ends up, and we all know this, or more and more loneliness, more and more isolation, which actually we all know like deeply, especially if we look at ourselves, makes us feel worse, makes us feel more terrible, or maybe just be open to something completely different, right?
Yeah.
Um, and so I want to just touch on something that I think is interesting that's happened with sort of our global economies, but also in this country, which is I think a new type of feudalism that's also emerging right now. So, we are seeing platforms, technology corporations take over almost every other aspect of life, right? So like history of the world is a private corporation that calls itself a technology company, Uber.
Yeah.
Biggest hotel company, same thing, right? Airbnb. And so some of these companies are existing in a more feudal relationship, or Amazon, of course, charges rent to essentially be on their platform. So some of these corporations are actually not even profitable or have rarely been profitable, like Uber as an example, yet are worth like billions upon billions of dollars, hundreds of billions of dollars. So sort of the boogeyman of the profit motive that has now given rise to mere speculation and valuation.
Hmm.
So I guess my question is we see that on the one hand, but we also see examples. I do field work in East Africa, South Africa, where I was living last year in 2022. I spend a lot of time in South America. I'm South Asian myself. South Asia and India is very disturbing to me right now with the right wing nationalist anti free press kind of Modi government. But I do want to say that in South America and in Africa, for example, in the African continent, you can go between, I think, about 30 countries without any sort of formal visa at all, not even a passport. There's freedom of mobility. We see, the nation of South Africa leading the charge to try to call out Israel for its war crimes, which are genocidal war crimes. Hamas also committed war crimes as well. We see in South America the rise of many different governments that are emerging out of all the brutality and pain that was inflicted upon these peoples actually by the neoliberal state led by Reagan, and then on and on and on, including directly in Grenada, where your family is from, Maurice. We see people saying, well, we're turning the page. We're moving to something else. We're moving on. It's not even about like being at war with you all. We're just third space. We're moving on to a third space, from Bolivia to Chile to Colombia, to the recent elections in Guatemala. Really, really exciting. So it's sometimes about where we look, right? And so I guess I want to ask about, one sort of set of pushes that are about further closure and further and further disconnecting us, even from profitability, even our multinational corporations from profitability, and the other that is sort of a renewed investment in community, in nation. And I don't mean a divisive nationalism, but in sort of like we're moving on. We're
Yeah.
moving on.
Yeah.
That's progress.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it's something that I want to wrestle with, right? Because I think, I spoke about it before, about there being two things: systems that are dying and systems that are emerging. And so they're operating concurrently. We're experiencing the symptoms of the dying and the emergence, right? We're seeing the little shoots spring up out of the mud, even as there's a collapse, right? And I think it's important that we don't tell a story that is totalizing about one or the other, right? And so, yeah, I mean, absolutely, we're witnessing some of the more disturbing and maybe bizarre examples of corporate sort of lack of accountability. And like, yeah, you have these schemes like, Uber and some of these larger corporations that it's ironic because it's like the height of capitalism, but it's not profitable, right?
It's in techno feudalism where
Yeah,
these companies own almost nothing and hire almost nobody.
that's right. That's right. So you have those examples, and I would put, a lot of the social media corporations in that bucket as well, because like,
Absolutely.
if you take Facebook, Facebook is run and owned by one individual. It's one individual's project, one individual's business, but it has the impact and capacity and power and influence of a state, right? But it's not held accountable to any of the international law that holds states accountable. And its effort and its purpose, as much as their PR talks about them building communities, its purpose is profit. The business of business is business, right? And
And the
so
capture of all our data and our attention, and to redirect us and our minds wherever they want us to go.
absolutely, and we're witnessing this huge sort of experiment. Like I've said this and I've heard people say this, that, probably in a decade or two or three, we're going to re-examine our relationship to social media in the way that many of us re-examined our relationship to smoking. It's like there's images of doctors smoking in a hospital, right? In ads for Marlboros, right? I feel like at a certain point, we're going to learn a lot from this experiment of what this constantly evolving algorithm that is totally designed to suck up our attention and totally designed to have us addicted to these devices for the purpose of being able to monetize our attention. In some ways, it's like colonizing our attention, right? So you
Yeah, and
have
hormones are raw materials of digital capitalism,
yeah,
are
and so that's operating, right? And then you have these shoots of a different world that are taking place. A lot of times it's taking place in the global south. Sometimes it's taking place right here in this country with resistance movements and these like resurgent labor movement that's taking place that, like I am so excited to hear the Sean Fain, the president of the UAW, talk about a general strike in a few years, right? So these shoots of both resistance and just not even, I wouldn't even call it resistance, just shoots of a different possibilities are emerging. And to me, it's natural that that's happening in this in between time when the old system is dying and becoming discredited, when corporations like Theranos and other corporations that are based on a lie but evaluated in the billions are collapsing, and we're witnessing the collapse of those things. We're also seeing new modes of relationships and a desire for people to break out of, like I know some folks that are going to Barbados, and I love the Prime Minister of Barbados, Prime Minister Motley. She talks about this. Like we're a small country, but the arrogance of folks in the global north or folks in the US to like feel threatened by Barbados choosing to relate to, as an independent country, relate to other countries and being entitled to Barbados to be under this almost like retrench of the Cold War, where you have to decide, are you with the U.S. camp, or it's like, no, we are independent country that could decide our own future, right? More and more countries and more peoples are attempting to develop and to pursue their independence outside of those traditional paradigms. To me, that's hopeful, and I'll tell you why that's hopeful. So, we talk about immigration in this country, right? But we don't talk about the drivers of immigration, right? So, just a few years ago, our country imposed significant sanctions against the country of Venezuela because we're unhappy with their political system, and we're unhappy with the decisions that they made. And we wanted to influence internal political conflicts and put our thumb on the scale inside of Venezuela. And so we imposed significant sanctions. And it's not surprising that the economy of Venezuela collapsed and millions of people of Venezuela fell into poverty. And then as a result, they migrated, because you would migrate too in order to support your family and save your family. So now a significant percentage of the people coming in for the southern border are Venezuelan, right? Imagine a world where countries like Venezuela, countries like a number of the countries in South America that you talked about that are seeking out a new way, built that new way and had security, and were able to support and create physical and economic security for their people and had stability on their own terms, outside of the sort of like machinations of some of the larger politics of the US versus China versus Russia. Um, that that more stable, more secure Venezuela or Chile or Guatemala um, would ultimately create and be part of a more secure world, where if people sought to migrate, they did it on their own terms, but not to migrate in order to seek security, but to migrate in order to positively engage in a cross-cultural dialogue or engage in travel we can't do that if we continue to create the conditions for an insecure world. And that would be giving up empire. giving up the need for empire. It
That's
would
it.
it would mean letting that go so we could have a more secure world.
And there could be a great amount of economic prosperity in being partners in a sort of new economy, right? I mean, it's going to be great for American businesses
Absolutely.
because no longer will there be this it would just be a partnership, right?
Yeah, I mean, I was reading something about how the US is attempting to replace the Wagner Group as the point people for security in Africa, right? And a lot of the ways that our country chooses to engage countries in the global south is around quote unquote security. So selling US arms to these countries or putting US military outposts in these countries. So if you are living in this country and you're experiencing poverty, the face of the United States is a military outpost or conversations about how the elites in your country are making deals with the elites in the United States, right? What if the face of the United States was cultural partnerships or economic partnerships or technological partnerships or where there was mutual respect, right? Imagine how that would transform the relationships between countries and open up the opportunities for all types of all types of relationships, prosperity, growth, not on neoliberal terms, but on the terms of shared interest, right? But we would have to give up empire if we were interested in that course. We would have to give up this idea that the only way that we could be safe is if we're everybody's global police force.
But an empire has been sucking the life energy out of all of us in America too. So it's no good for anybody. It's no good for
Absolutely.
anybody.
And it's ironic because there's a cost to having all these outposts everywhere.
Over 50% of our taxes, right? Over
It,
50%
yes,
tons.
yeah, there's a deep cost. So we're spending a lot of money and resources, and we have to question whether or not it actually makes us safe. So there's this story about how all of this military spending and all of these outposts are designed to protect us and to protect freedom and to protect democracy. Um, but if we actually listen to some of the critiques of this foreign policy, and if we actually put ourselves in the position of folks who are experiencing it from their lens, it's like, why is this US outpost advantaging dictators and right-wing authoritarians in my country? And how, like, I hear the United States talking about freedom, but like, all I see is the United States like doing billion-dollar arms deals with the Saudis, right? And if you're in that region and you're a regular person, then are we surprised that some people are skeptical about how sincere we are? And are we surprised that some people grow opposition to us because we chose to have those outposts? And what would it look like if we made those billions of dollars of investments in building people's capacity,
Mhm.
in building those deep and real relationships and investments in the actual people, and not simply in ensuring that those countries clear their coffers in order to make investments in our war machine, right? I mean,
Exactly.
we should we be surprised that some people might take objection to that and not see that as a investment in shared security, right? And so the one thing I want to share a little bit about is because you talked about the how, because there is a lot of corruption. One of the things that we're doing at the Working Families Party, and this is not something that happens overnight. So there's a slow burn to this, but we're seeing progress. We recruit everyday people, educators like yourself, grassroots organizers, parents, people who deal with the challenges and contradictions of everyday life. We believe that in a democracy, the people should govern. And so we recruit the people and put them in positions where they could run for office and win on the local level, all the way up to Congress. And so, Brandon Johnson is the mayor of Chicago.
Yeah, awesome.
Yeah, it's amazing. And when I met him years ago, he was a union organizer and educator and teacher. And then the WFP and the local organization, their United Working Families, endorsed him and supported him in his effort to be a Cook County commissioner. And a lot of people thought that that was a fool's errand. He won. 5 years later, people thought it was a fool's errand for him to run for mayor. He's the mayor, right? And so this actually works. And as mayor, he's having a huge impact on climate change, on how to approach public safety in a way that actually heals the community, invests in the community. Like Summer Lee is another example, somebody who it's a working class Black woman who has a legal background and was on the front lines of civil rights and ran for office on the local level and was in the state legislature, the first Black woman to be in that seat. And Democrats opposed her because they're so frightened of what she represented again and again and again. And she won hard-fought battle after hard-fought battle. She ran for Congress. She won. Organizations like AIPAC threw millions and millions of dirty right-wing corporate money into her race to discredit her. She won anyhow. So it's not easy. We will face opposition. But when we have people like Summer Lee, Cori Bush, Jamal Bowman, and others in our Congress, that means that Cori Bush, when the vast majority of people want a ceasefire, want an end to the suffering that's happening in Gaza, Cori Bush could represent those people and and uh, and write a resolution calling for a ceasefire. And at first, it was just a dozen members who supported that ceasefire resolution. We're now at more than 60 members of Congress who have either supported that resolution or have come out for a ceasefire, right? And so what I want people who are listening to this program to understand is that it's easy to be really cynical about our politics. It's easy to notice the corruption because it exists. But the thing that I want to remind everybody is that just like there's symptoms of the corrupt system, and I would say that the symptoms show the corrupt system dying and not working as well, because years ago, it would be impossible almost to imagine a Cori Bush or Jamal Bowman or AOC, for that matter, in Congress. There are also examples of new things emerging, of independent political organizations like the Working Families Party, like Justice Democrats, like many others coming together in order to build this very new way of everyday people getting involved in a deep way that is disconnected from that old school corporate politics. Is it hard? Yes. Are there challenges? Yes. Are there contradictions? Absolutely. But it is emergent. And I want to invite everybody to get involved, because if you're listening, there's no reason why you can't run for local office, where you can't run for town council or for city council or for alderman or on your library board or on your school board. Everyday people who are not part of the establishment, who don't have access to a lot of money, who may not ever think of themselves as leaders. Those are the people who are the best primed, who are experts in their own experience. And we want to encourage and give folks the confidence to know that they can lead in that way.
So that ties into sort of my final question, which has two parts. This is so important and inspiring, Maurice, which is first, any thoughts with this forthcoming presidential election coming, which has a number of independent candidates as well, and tied to that, how can we all get involved with the Working Families Party and contact and work with your organization and others that you mentioned, like the Justice Democrats? That's the first part, and then I want to just sort of end by asking you about your own connections to the arts, to music,
Yeah.
from your incredible cousins, who from KMD and the great MF Doom, to your own, what got you, not even what got you, but like kind of your engagements with punk and music. Like, how are those things connected? And you mentioned it earlier, but how are those things connected to like who you are now and where you're heading, and kind of like what's your utopia, so to speak, if you even believe in such,
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, the first question first around the presidential. So the Working Families Party, our national committee, like last cycle and the cycle before, will likely opine on the presidential election. And in doing that, we'll develop a process and a timeline for doing that and engage that question very seriously. But I can't get ahead of them, and they haven't done that yet. But what I can say is that the Working Families Party is informed by a strategy that we call block and build. And we believe both blocking authoritarianism and building the long-term infrastructure for a mighty people's movement that is outside of the corporate politics of the two-party system is essential. We think both are essential, and sometimes they're at tension, and it's our job at Working Families Party to hold that tension. And so in this country currently, and we didn't talk a lot about the two-party system, but maybe bring me back again and I'll talk about the fallacy of the two-party system, why we need to challenge it. But in this rigid two-party system, one of the parties has been captured by a particular brand of authoritarianism. And as a result, I have been screaming at the rafters to anybody who wants to hear, put aside whatever prior political commitments you might have, however you might view yourself as a Republican, as a Democrat, as a conservative, as a Republican, as a conservative, as a progressive, and consider what it might look like if we lived in a country where the way we think about voting, the limited access that we do have in a very corporately captured system that we do have to democracy, if all of that was off the table, how could we possibly, as working people, ever imagine to have the types of freedoms that we've been fighting for over decades and decades and generations? That's what's actually on that's actually what we're talking about, because one of the parties has been captured, right? The Republican Party of the past was a very different party, but this party has been captured by a particular movement. And so I'm trying to build the biggest united front of everyday people to block that movement from gaining governing power. So that's the block part, right? Which often means challenging Republicans. The build part means challenging the entire political establishment. We need to build a new way. We need to build a radically different way. That's not going to happen tomorrow. It's not going to happen next week, but it can happen over time. It can happen if people like the people listening to this podcast shake out of the cynicism that suggests that the old ways of doing things are the only ways that we might do things, that there's some elite pulling the strings, and they've already rigged it and there's nothing we can do. I don't accept that. One of the fallacies behind some of the conspiratorial thinking is that if all of these elites are pulling the strings, why do anything, right? I believe that a lot of the conspiracy thinking, my conspiracy is that the conspiratorial thinking is engineered by the elites so that we don't get involved, right? um,
There's little question about that on
yeah.
many different levels. That's true. Yeah.
Yes, I mean, why get involved if there's like a small cabal of people that always have already written out the outcomes of every single election and every single world event, right? So we have to block them, but we have to build. And when we're looking at the context of this presidential cycle, I want folks to think about what strategies, think about each of the candidates, think about the independent candidates, and think about them from the standpoint of the strategy of blocking authoritarianism and putting us in the best position to build a new way. And that's what I'm going to be working on. And working on that uncomfortable tension between both, right? Now, you talked a little bit about music, art, culture. I believe that culture is one of the most powerful tools, one of the most powerful weapons, if you will, in the war against cruelty, right? In the war for compassion, if you will, and I'm choosing to use the word war, right? Because there's this talk about a culture war, right? And I'm pretty sure that binary culture war, the only people that benefit from that are the elites. I want to build, if we're going to fight a war, let's build a big we to fight a war against cruelty. And culture, to me, is the best tool, because we were talking about hip hop. I can't tell you how listening to Public Enemy or listening to KRS-One, or how deeply it impacted how I think about the world.
It's totally why I'm the way I am too, Maurice. I mean, it's really what informs me too.
Oh,
Yeah. Yeah.
oh, and if at the time I had read an essay or I had listened to a lecture on the same subject matter, I guarantee you it would not have penetrated as deeply into my soul, right? And so what I learned from my experience just as a listener and eventually as somebody who curated and created music is, I mean, I can't tell you the number of my band. There's a hardcore punk rock band called Cypher, and we discussed a lot of the themes that we're talking about right now. We talked a lot about racial justice and the history of this country. I can't tell you the number of our fans who never would have considered these ideas, who lived in the Bible Belt and were basically only hearing one message, who were completely transformed because they fell in love with our music, right? So what I learned about that is, in some ways in politics, we have it backwards. So a lot of the political tables that I sit around, people talk about polling and people talk about this new political app and people talk about metrics. But the reality is that we're human and all of our institutions are human institutions, right? And so the things that motivate humans don't fit within these like clean metrics. We as humans, even as we grow older, continue to be captivated by play and joy. We as humans continue to be attracted to fun and excitement and culture. And we as humans, we all, that feeling of connection when you're sitting, like you talked about coming to New York and going to a Trinidadian restaurant and eating some roti. And
Ooh, I love
you,
those.
you can't think of a more human experience, right? That has nothing to do with, like, you watch the political news and they're like, they're looking through the crosstabs of a poll, or they're a politics that puts at the core the human proclivity for joy, for play, for culture. That is a politics that could be an invitation, that could be irresistible. And to me, it's when I think about the work that I do and my experience, both like looking up to and learning from a master, Doom, and then myself creating music and coming up in the hardcore punk rock scene. To me, the way that those two things merge is that I continually am turned on and interested in how can we be irresistible? Not not how can I dunk on the other guy, which is how I see a lot of people sort of use politics, using politics as a tool to demonstrate how correct you are or how morally right you are, right? What I've learned from my work in the arts is that arts are the arts and culture could be contagious, the arts and culture could be irresistible. And when you're caught up in that contagion, then you're in a position to have a deep conversation about how we want to be in the world. And that is, to me, the possibility, the true possibility of a transformative politics. And that is what I'm always seeking. That is like the thing. Every day I wake up, I'm seeking those transformative politics versus some of the discourse that I see online, which is like somebody who calls himself a leftist dunking on somebody who calls himself a conservative, somebody who calls himself a conservative dunking on somebody who calls himself a leftist, somebody who calls himself a liberal dunking on both of them, and us feeling more hollow because of it. And so,
Yes. Yes.
so the thing that I'm seeking is that thing, the feeling when I first listened to from beginning to end, it takes a nation of millions to hold us back, right?
Public Enemy.
Yes, the feeling that I felt the first time, I listened to Criminal Minded, right? Like that transcendence and connection, and the thing that, I want to come back to a theme there. Those were artists that had a point of view. Those were artists that weren't sugarcoating things. Those were artists that were saying something very real to them. And even if I didn't understand everything, I believed them. And one of the things that I tell candidates, these emerging candidates that are coming up from being organizers, your job is not to ensure that every one of the voters that you're building in your movement, every one of them um, um, agrees with you. because you can't agree 100% with anybody. Your job is to ensure that your folks believe in you. And that's a market difference, right? Like, look, we don't even agree with ourselves. I wake up and I have all types of internal conflicts. How can I set as an expectation that I agree 100% with you, right? But what I can do, and we could relate to this in our interpersonal lives, when we believe in somebody, when we truly love and believe in somebody, then that connection, that sense of belief, that sense of love could weather all types of disagreements, right? And so to me, that type of connection that you make, like that I make with KRS-One, and I proudly, yeah, he's the teacher. KRS is a human being with all types of flaws. I don't agree with him 100%. He makes all types of claims in his music, but I believe him. I believe that what he's saying is authentic, and there's a truth to that authenticity, even if I disagree. And a politics that is an invitation, that is broad, to me, taps into the thing that KRS gets, the thing that Chuck D gets, the thing that Doom gets, right? That is how I feel called to merge what I learned from Doom with what I learned from Kwame Ture.
I just have a lot of joy, appreciation, and love for you, brother, and all the things that you stand for as a human being and as someone who's really doing everything you can to bring greater compassion into our lives. So thank you, Maurice. Thank you for joining Utopias. We're going to keep building together. We can't wait to have you back. Let's just keep it rolling. Thank you.
Thank you.
The Utopias podcast with Professor Ramesh Srinivasan is produced and edited by me, Phoebe Browse. You can access episodes on all streaming platforms. And if you have questions or comments, please email podcastutopias@gmail.com. That's podcastutopias@gmail.com. See you all next time.